In this episode, we're going to talk about a way of thinking that turns a messy network into a network you can actually defend. When beginners first learn networking, it's easy to imagine one big connected space where every device can talk to every other device. And the only real question is whether the internet can get in. Security thinking flips that perspective by assuming something will eventually go wrong, and then asking whether the design limits the blast radius when it does. Zones, segmentation, and trust boundaries are the tools we use to make sure a compromise in one place does not automatically become a compromise everywhere. These ideas show up in home setups, small businesses, and large enterprises, but they matter most when there are valuable systems that should not be casually reachable. Our goal is to make these concepts feel practical and intuitive, so you can picture how a well-designed network constrains attackers and supports defenders. A useful starting point is to define what a zone really means in a network security context. A zone is a grouping of systems that share similar trust expectations and similar security controls, so that traffic entering or leaving that zone can be governed by clear rules. You can think of a zone as a neighborhood with a gate, where the gate is not only a technical control like a firewall, but also a policy decision about what belongs there. For example, a zone might contain user workstations, another might contain servers that provide business applications, and another might contain systems that are especially sensitive like authentication services or financial systems. The important part is not the labels. It's the idea that you are deliberately shaping who should be able to talk to whom. When everything is in one flat network, any compromise can quickly turn into lateral movement, where an attacker moves from one machine to the next because the network makes it easy. Zones are a way to make that movement harder and more detectable. Segmentation is the practical act of creating those separations so that traffic must cross a controlled point to move between groups. This can be done in different ways, but at a conceptual level it means you are breaking the network into smaller pieces and putting rules in place at the seams. Those seams are where you can enforce policy, collect logs, and block unwanted access. A common beginner mistake is to think segmentation is only about hiding things, but it's really about controlling interactions. If a workstation is compromised, segmentation can prevent it from directly reaching a database server, even if both are inside the same organization. That forces the attacker to find additional paths, which increases the chance of detection and reduces the speed of an attack. It also gives defenders a clearer picture of what is normal, because normal traffic patterns are more predictable when boundaries exist. Trust boundaries are the conceptual lines where your assumptions change, and they matter because security failures often happen when assumptions are applied on the wrong side of the line. Inside a trusted zone, you might assume devices are managed, patched, and monitored, and that users are authenticated. Outside that zone, you assume traffic may be hostile, identities may be forged, and devices may be compromised. The boundary is where you translate between those worlds, applying checks and controls that make sense given the risk. A trust boundary is not always the edge of the internet, because internal networks can contain untrusted segments too, such as guest wireless, contractor networks, or unmanaged devices. Beginners sometimes assume internal equals trusted, but modern security design assumes internal can be hostile as well. Once you adopt that mindset, boundaries become more than just perimeter walls. They become internal checkpoints that limit how far problems can spread. A common and helpful zone example is the area used for public-facing services, often called a demilitarized zone, DMZ. The idea is that systems meant to be reachable from the internet should not sit in the same zone as internal user devices or sensitive servers. If a public-facing system is compromised, you want it to be isolated so the attacker cannot easily pivot deeper. That isolation is achieved by carefully controlling what traffic can go from the public zone into internal zones, and by limiting what the public zone can reach. It's not enough to put a server in a separate zone and then allow broad connectivity back inside, because that defeats the purpose. The strength of a DMZ comes from strict, minimal pathways, where only the required ports and destinations are allowed. This pattern is a clear example of a trust boundary that holds, because it assumes exposure and builds containment. Segmentation can also be applied to users and devices, which is often where organizations see the biggest payoff. User workstations are frequently exposed to risk through browsing, email, and downloaded files, So treating them as a distinct zone with limited reach into critical systems is a strong defensive move. When workstations can reach everything, one compromised laptop can become the starting point for a much larger incident. When workstations are restricted to only the services they need, the attacker has to work harder to move laterally. This also changes defender visibility because unusual attempts to access restricted services become signals. In a flat network, unusual access can blend in because everything is allowed. In a segmented network, blocked attempts stand out, and alerts can be more meaningful because they represent violations of a deliberate policy. Another important concept is the difference between macro-segmentation and micro-segmentation, which is really about scale and granularity. Macro-segmentation is dividing the network into broad zones like user, server, and public-facing, which is a strong baseline for most environments. Micro-segmentation goes further by controlling traffic at a much finer level, sometimes down to individual applications or even individual workloads. You can imagine microsegmentation as turning a big apartment building into separate units with locked doors, instead of leaving every interior door open. This can dramatically reduce lateral movement, but it also requires more planning and more maintenance, because you need to understand legitimate traffic paths in detail. Beginners don't need to master the implementation, but they should understand the security value. The smaller the allowed communication surface, the harder it is for attackers to move, and the easier it is to detect abnormal attempts. Designing defensible zones also means deciding where to put shared services that everyone depends on, like authentication and name resolution. These services are often central to how networks function, which makes them attractive targets. If an attacker compromises a core service, they may be able to misdirect traffic, impersonate users, or disrupt operations broadly. That means these services often belong in a highly trusted zone with very restricted access. The boundary rules should allow only what is necessary for systems to use those services, and administrative access should be even more tightly controlled. Beginners sometimes place critical services wherever there is space, but defensible design treats placement as a security decision. You're trying to reduce who can talk to those services, and you're trying to make any attempt to tamper with them highly visible. It's also important to understand that segmentation is not useful if policy is vague or exceptions become the norm. Networks get messy because people add one-off rules for convenience, temporary access, or troubleshooting, and then those exceptions never get cleaned up. Over time, the boundary that was supposed to hold becomes riddled with holes, and the network drifts back toward flatness. Defensible design includes discipline around change management, where any rule that crosses a boundary is justified, reviewed, and revisited. Even in a beginner-friendly view, you can see why this matters. If you allow a user zone to access a sensitive zone broadly, you've removed the very constraint that was supposed to protect you. Good design is not only about drawing lines, it's about maintaining those lines under pressure. You also want to connect segmentation to the idea of least privilege, but applied to network pathways rather than individual user accounts. Least privilege means you allow only what is needed for a legitimate purpose, and you deny everything else. In networks, that translates into allowing specific sources to reach specific destinations on specific ports, and denying broad open communication that is hard to justify. This approach reduces the number of possible attack paths, because attackers rely on finding something reachable and permissive. It also improves detection, because when most traffic is intentionally constrained, the unexpected stands out. Beginners sometimes worry that least privilege will break things, and it can if done carelessly, but that's why good design starts with understanding normal business flows. You can tighten gradually and verify, rather than locking everything down blindly. Trust boundaries that hold also require thinking about how administrators access systems, because administrative access is often the path attackers want most. If administrators can reach everything directly from their everyday workstation, then a compromise of that workstation can be catastrophic. A defensible design often includes a dedicated management zone, where administrative interfaces are reachable only from controlled entry points. This reduces exposure and creates a narrow place to monitor and enforce strong authentication. It also reduces accidental access, where someone stumbles into an administrative interface from the wrong place. Even if you don't implement this yourself, you should understand the principle. Administrative pathways should be fewer, stronger, and more observable than normal user pathways. When you separate management traffic from user traffic, you reduce the chance that a common compromise becomes a complete takeover. Segmentation also supports incident response because it gives you options when something goes wrong. In a flat network, if you discover a compromised machine, you may have only two bad choices: leave it connected and risk spread, or disconnect large chunks of the environment and cause major disruption. In a segmented network, you can isolate a zone or a subset of systems more surgically, preserving critical operations while limiting damage. You can also use boundaries to slow an attacker down, buying time to investigate and respond. This is an important mindset shift for beginners. Security is not just prevention, it is resilience. A network that is easy to defend is one where you can contain, observe, and recover without shutting down everything. Zones and boundaries are what make that kind of controlled response possible. As we conclude, the main idea is that defensible networks are designed to limit trust and to force important traffic through controlled seams. Zones are deliberate groupings based on similar risk and control needs. Segmentation is the act of separating those groups and governing the interactions, and trust boundaries are the lines where your assumptions change and protections must be strongest. A boundary that holds is one that stays meaningful over time, with minimal pathways, disciplined exceptions, and clear ownership. When you design networks this way, you make attacker movement harder, you make abnormal behavior more visible, and you give defenders practical options when incidents happen. Most importantly, you stop treating the network as a single shared space and start treating it as a set of controlled relationships. That perspective is one of the most powerful shifts a new cybersecurity student can make, because it turns security from hope into architecture.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.